Dr. Bergin, in Agenda for Change, you outline a number of challenges that the new government will face in terms of homeland security. What are the most critical of these challenges?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Luke, that during the election campaign, issues to do with public safety, crime, counter-terrorism weren't really on the agenda. But now, of course, the new government is in place. Issues to do with disaster resilience, cyber security, counter-terrorism, emergency management, all these issues will now have to be wrestled with by the new government. In terms of priorities, I think one issue that I would raise that is outlined in our Agenda for Change report is the need to now grip up, if you like, at a political level, issues to do with cyber security, counter-terrorism, emergency management, and strong consideration, I believe, should be given to creating a separate ministry at cabinet level to deal with these issues. Currently, the Attorney-General, as Australia's first law officer, has over 60 portfolio responsibilities. Most of those portfolio responsibilities do not bear really on operational domestic security. So what I would argue is that in order to get greater focus, greater accountability around issues to do with counter-terrorism, disaster response, cyber security, serious and organised crime, we need a dedicated minister at cabinet level. Not someone who would play second fiddle to the Attorney-General, but someone who could argue the brief for those issues at cabinet level. Wouldn't need a new department, just as the Foreign Affairs Department caters for both the Foreign Minister and the Trade Minister. So too could Attorney-Generals support a Minister for Security and Resilience, is what I would call the new Minister. And I think that would advance a much greater focus on these homeland security challenges. I think it's all fair to say that the Attorney-General, when he was the Shadow Attorney-General, has made it clear that he'd very much like to focus on issues to do with his role as the Commonwealth First Law Officer. And again, to underline the point about the need for a separate Minister for Security and Resilience, I think given how much investment the Commonwealth spends in disaster response and recovery, that we need to put a lot more effort into getting a national approach to disaster resilience. And I would put the emphasis, or suggest that the emphasis ought to be put much more on disaster mitigation. The Commonwealth spends billions, has spent billions in recent years in terms of responding to natural disasters, but we've spent very little, indeed probably between $200 and $300 million in recent years in terms of preparation, in terms of mitigation. Yet some studies show that a dollar spent in mitigation can save $3 in terms of the savings in terms of cost, response and recovery investment. So I think mitigation is a key point there. Another point I would stress is that the new government has said that they wish to focus on greater efficiencies in the healthcare system, and of course while that's a laudable aim, I guess one point that I would make in the context of disaster resilience is that we should not compromise our ability to respond to mass casualty events, whether it be man-made or natural events. And I think our system of health preparedness needs to be benchmarked against world best practice, and I think we need to have national standards for responding in our healthcare system to emergencies. And so while I fully support the new government's effort to streamline health spending, that should not be, in my view, at the cost of our preparedness to deal with mass casualty events.
Of the challenges you've just mentioned, which would be the most difficult to address? And do you have any suggestions for the new government in addressing the issue?
Well, there are a few issues that I perhaps haven't noted that I would simply throw into the mix as well. One issue is the whole question of serious and organised crime as a national security concern. The latest estimate that we have from the Australian Crime Commission is that serious and organised crime is costing this country $15 billion. And I think there is a strong case for supporting those agencies such as the Crime Commission and so forth, the Federal Police, that are on the front line in dealing with serious and organised crime. I would support the idea of, for example, the Crime Commission having some overseas representation to work with like-minded criminal intelligence bodies, and similarly to host those agencies overseas within our own domestic criminal intelligence network. So I think I would certainly support efforts to elevate the importance of crime as a serious and organised crime as a security issue. The other area that I would note perhaps is the role of business in national security and homeland security. A number of areas I mentioned there obviously is the whole question of infrastructure resilience and the need to work with the private sector to support a strong infrastructure. The area of business in disaster response, after all, business in many ways is much more nimble in terms of being able to respond to disasters, natural disasters than government agencies. So I think business needs to be drawn in much more to the whole issue of disaster response and recovery. Cyber security, another area obviously where business needs to be drawn in. So the role of the private sector, I think, is one that perhaps we've overlooked in the past when it comes to national security, and I'd like to think that the new government would try and leverage the capabilities of our business community in advancing infrastructure resilience, counter-terrorism, counter-disaster management and so forth.
Dr. Bergin, it's been more than a decade since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. What are Australia's counter-terrorism efforts at the moment, and are these efforts still warranted?
I think you're right that we haven't seen a spectacular like we saw on 9/11 since that date. But of course, as the events of Boston earlier this year reminded us these sort of events remain a persistent issue. So I think for the new government, it's a matter of ensuring that we don't either overinvest or underinvest, but certainly recognise that terrorism is going to be an ongoing issue. I would particularly like to highlight two areas that the new government will need to look at. One is the area of telecommunications legislation. The current legal regime for telecommunications intercepts is really old legislation for old technology, so that whole area of telephone intercepts and the legal framework needs to be looked at. And the other area, which of course has attracted a lot of attention, is the whole area of data retention. And I think that's an area that, while sensitive, the new government may want to consider an exposure draft in terms of how long data should be held by telecommunications and internet companies and so forth. So I think on terrorism legislation, it's a matter of not swinging madly to the right of the road, if you like, or madly to the left, but maintaining a steady course. But we certainly shouldn't assume that because we haven't seen a terrorism spectacular, we don't need to focus on those issues. Particularly, I'd highlight the area of sort of homegrown terrorism and the need for Australia to maintain a very robust system of counter-radicalisation, particularly in the online area. That's where a lot of the problems are now, both on static websites, but also in social media. A lot of material that's being put out now that can potentially influence young people, and I think the new government will need to develop, strengthen our capabilities in countering online radicalisation.